The Winter of Red Snow, The Revolutionary War Diary of Abigail Jane Stewart. Reading 7. February 6, 1778, Friday. Still sunny. On the warm side of our house is a patch of dry dirt. I spread a quilt and laid Johnny on his back. He squinted at the sunlight and kicked his legs. I was so happy to see him smile again until Mama came out. "Abigail, he shall catch a cold. He's just a baby." I ran upstairs crying. I only wanted him to feel fresh air on his cheeks. February 7th, 1778, Saturday. Rain all day. Winds are high. Elizabeth and I bought 6 pumpkins up from the cellar and spent the day slicing them into strips that we hung on a string from the rafters to dry, since there are no shirts today. It makes the house look cheerful, and there is a sweet scent. The seeds filled the large iron skillet where we roasted them with salt until crisp. Papa finished 4 pairs of shoes and took them to camp. He said a lieutenant delivered them to 4 soldiers who were married yesterday. It seemed that some of the women drivers from Philadelphia have found themselves husbands. Papa also told us that another spy was caught. Her name is Anne McIntyre. February 8th, 1778, Sunday. Lucy sat in front of me at church, and I could not help but stare at the back of her neck. If I hadn't seen with my own eyes the wig-maker's scissors cut off her beautiful hair, I would have not known. Wisps curled from under her bonnet just as before. After the final hymn, she turned around and leaned towards me and whispered so softly I almost didn't hear, "Mama and Papa know not." Poor Lucy, carrying such a secret night and day, brushing her hair when no one will see, and then quickly tying on her nightcap. She looked sad. Outside I said to her, "Have you not been eating, Lucy? Your face is so thin." She glanced at her parents, who were over by their wagon, and said, "Oh, Abby, the 9 shillings are gone." Her eyes filled with tears. "I hid them in the barn under one of the nests. The other morning 2 hens were missing and all the eggs, and my shillings." "Are you sure? Have you looked everywhere?" Yes, Mama's waiting. I must go. Hast thou told anyone, Abby?" "Not a soul," said I. February 9th, 1778, Monday. It snowed last night and all morning. Mom and I were wringing out the bedclothes to hang when a number of horses passed on the road. We ran to the window and scratched off the ice in time to see a sleigh round the bend towards headquarters. "That must be Lady Washington," cried Elizabeth, "all the way from Mount Vernon." May we go?" Sally asked. Mama looked at her hands, red and rough from being in hot water all day. "My goodness, no," she said. "The dear lady shall need a rest from her long journey, not visitors." Mama looked at the hearth where a fresh round of rye and Injun bread was almost done. She smiled. "But mayhaps we should extend our hospitality." We interrupted her by hurrying into bonnets and cloaks and shoes and wool stockings. Elizabeth pinned my blanket over my shoulders. The snow was almost to our knees in the fields, so instead of taking the shortcut, we stayed on the road, a 45-minute walk. Mrs. Washington's sleigh was by the stone stable, not as grand as we thought it might have been there, and icicles hanging from its frame. Suddenly I felt most shy. Billy Lee opened the door and bade us come in. From the kitchen came several female voices and an excited gasp when we were noticed. "Who are these dear children?" said one of the women coming over to greet us. She was about my height, extremely plump, and had a friendly, smiling face, though I must admit she was not at all pretty. I did not like her wide nostrils nor the mole on her cheek. "Ma'am," said Billy Lee, "these here are Mrs. Stewart's girls, those that keeps your husband's shirts, ma'am." This was Lady Washington. Sally found her voice first. Mama said, "We're to welcome thee to Valley Forge. She hopes the inns you stayed didn't have bed bugs like the Kings of Prussia Inn down the road here." Mrs. Washington laughed. "Sweet child, thank your mother for me. Since you asked, I'll tell. I saw no bugs, but the beds were lumpy and damp from lack of warm fire. There was quite a lot of noise downstairs in the taverns, but, child, I had nothing but kindness shown to me the entire journey. 13 nights, I believe. Roads were rough, of course. We had to leave my coach with the innkeeper near Brandywine Creek because of the snow. It's his sleigh outside." She lifted the cloth to peek at our bread. "Oh my, can you girls stay for tea? I'm deathly weary, but I do need a hot cup, not English tea, of course." We no-thanked her politely and began to back out the room, but her hand flew up. Forgive my poor manners. I want to introduce my friends here. Their husbands are officers, and they've been staying with other families here at Valley Forge. Also, Oni, could you come here, please? Mrs. Washington gestured a Negro lady unloading food from a large traveling basket. My mouth began to water at the sight of hams and wheels of cheese, dried fruits, jars of preserves, salted fish, walnuts, and almonds. How do, Mrs. Oni said, dipping her head slightly. I noticed General Washington standing in the doorway. He is so very much taller than his wife, some say 6'2". With hands behind his back, he appeared the most relaxed I have ever seen him. He smiled at us. As Mrs. Washington moved busily around the kitchen, his eyes followed her with tenderness. February 10th, 1778, Tuesday. Laundry done and dried. The bags are too heavy to carry, so Papa put them in the wagon. Elizabeth and I rode on the seat with him to headquarters. After lifting the sacks down to us, Papa drove off and said for us to walk home within the hour. Such busyness in the front room. General Washington was standing at one of the tables surrounded by an assortment of officers and 2 of his generals. Oni was in the kitchen with the cook and 2 other women. There were 8 loaves of brown bread on the table. Their fresh baked aroma was wonderful. I peeked in to see a long, narrow table against the wall where a soldier in apron was chopping turnips and onions. Hanging from an iron hook in the ceiling was a chunk of beef covered with peppercorns. It seemed a fine meal and was being prepared to welcome Lady Washington. Oni pointed upstairs, but I heard not what she said because so many voices were talking at once. Elizabeth and I together carried one laundry sack up the narrow stairway, then returned for the other. At least 4 times we had to step aside to let officers and servants up or down. What a crowded house! The door next to Mrs. Washington's sitting room was ajar. The first time we knocked, there came no response. Louder the second time. A woman opened it for us to enter. She, too, was my height and so very plump she had to step back and to the side for us to pass her skirts. From across the room came Mrs. Washington's voice. She sat by the window to catch the light for her knitting. Oh, girls, do join us. Let me introduce Lucy Knox, the smiling one who opened the door. And these other ladies are friends from Chester County. Come in, please. I again was struck with shyness, but Elizabeth spoke for both of us. Thank you, ma'am, but Papa says we're to deliver your husband's shirts, then return home. How I wanted to stay. I longed to hear more of their laughter and conversation. The room seemed tiny now, with so many women sitting at needlework. Their skirts touched one another, making it look as if one large quilt were spread over their laps. Well then, said Mrs. Washington, come again when you can stay. We could use your help. These poor soldiers are in dreadful need of socks and shirts, so do come back with your needles. Thy mother is invited as well. After supper I began the repairs to my hunting shirt, feeling ugly with myself for being so lazy. February 11th, 1778, Wednesday. Finish the shirt. I embroider my name, not as prettily as Elizabeth's, but it is there, Abigail Jane Stewart. A thaw has made so much mud we did not take the wagon out. Papa told us to stay in, but Sally disobeyed. She ran out into the road and immediately sunk down several inches. Elizabeth and I stood on a plank to help her. When she lifted her feet out, her shoes were gone. They are lost in the mud, and now she's just like one of the soldiers. Papa looked at her muddy legs and said, Thou shalt stay inside for the rest of the winter, young lady. Sally cried all morning and would not be comforted by any of us. Why can Papa not make me shoes right now? She wailed. I said, Sally, you have a warm house and a nice rug under thy feet. The soldiers have none. February 12th, 1778, Thursday. General Washington passed out handbills to all of us in Valley Forge. Too many farmers have been riding into Philadelphia to sell meat, eggs, dried vegetables, and fruits. The general cannot whip them all, says Papa, so he's setting up markets in his encampment. 3 sites, each open twice a week. This will help feed the army, though we shall still be paid in paper, not silver, and it may stop helping those big-bellied Englishmen. Papa drove us to the southern edge of the camp and pointed out one of the settlers. This is a small tent with a cooking fire by its door. A man in a fur coat was warming his hands and looked towards the camp. He's looking for customers, Papa said. Settlers follow the army. They sell liquor, tobacco, and foodstuffs to the soldiers, but their prices are high. Imagine 2 shillings per pound for hard soap. Generals dislike them. We took cranberries and dried apples to sell at the Stone Chimney Picket. Tomorrow there shall be a market at the Schuylkill River, on the north side of Sullivan's Bridge. Saturday near the Adjutant General's quarters, but I do not know where that is. Coming home, we passed the Fitzgerald house. 6 of the brothers were out in the mud playing. There was just a tiny bit of smoke coming from the chimney, so we stopped. Mrs. Fitzgerald sat in her rocker by the hearth, a shawl around her shoulders, and 2 of her biggest cats I've ever seen on her lap. There again in the cupboard I heard scratchings of mice. Even her cats help her not. Papa split wood, carried in 5 armfuls, and stoked up her fire. He gave her a sack of dried cranberries, a small ham, and the corn cake we'd brought along for our lunch. Mrs. Fitzgerald started to cry when we asked about her husband. There's been no word as to what the redcoats have done with him. As I climbed to the wagon seat, I looked for Tom to scold him, but he kept a safe distance. We were halfway down the road, and he still was making faces at me. If only his papa were here to whip him. February 13th, 1778, Friday. There are many of us down by Sullivan's Bridge to enjoy market day and to look at the soldiers. The Schuylkill is still frozen solid, and the snow on top is crisscrossed from all the children who slide and stomp across. Lucy was there with her mother, looking thin and withdrawn. Suddenly there appeared 4 of the Fitzgerald boys, yelling and banging sticks just to make noise and scare the old people. Tom ran up to Lucy, reached under her chin, pulled her bonnet string, then ran off hooting and waving it in the air like a kite. Poor Lucy! The shock on her face, on her mother's face, I cannot put in words. There she stood with her shorn hair for all to see. I hurried to her side, untying my own cap, and then put it on her head. Tears ran down her cheeks and wet my hand as I tied the string. "It shall be all right, Lucy," I said. February 14th, 1778, Saturday. Baths. Tonight I washed my hair. As Mama poured cups of warm water over my head, I cried. I'm heart-sore for Lucy, and know not what her parents will do to her. February 16th, 1778, Monday. As weeks pass, the laundry is looking grayish from our ash soap. Mrs. Washington asked if we could please use bleach. Mama brought out an old bucket that had been patched many times. She instructed Elizabeth and me to carefully, she would not let Sally do this, bring downstairs our chamber pot, and then also the one under hers and Papa's bed. We poured urine into the bucket and began soaking some of the dingiest items, which we later rinsed in fresh water. It is an unpleasant chore, but must be done. All day it was cold and overcast. I let Sally wear my shoes for 10 minutes so she could step outside. There's a stray cat she wants to pet. February 17th, 1778, Tuesday. Mama came with me and Elizabeth to return the laundry and visit Mrs. Washington. Every day except Sunday, officers' wives and ladies from Ballage Forge are there in the sitting room or in the kitchen. There's much knitting of socks and mending of shirts and such. I was so jealous and cross when Mrs. Washington asked Elizabeth to accompany her into camp, to deliver food and comfort the sick soldiers. Why did she not ask me? I wanted to go and think I deserved to go as much as anyone else. Miss Molly was coming up the path when Mama and I were leaving. She spoke kindly to me, asked about my studies and so forth, but I could not take my eyes off the road. There went Mrs. Washington's wagon, with my sisters sitting next to her, chatting like old friends. Why am I not as pretty as Elizabeth? I'm greatly upset today.